Hi, I'm Effie, and towards the end of last year, I decided that I wanted to try tackling every single book that my best friend, whose channel is Head in the Books, put on her best and worst list of 2023. I think there was a total of 16 books across those two lists. I did originally start trying to vlog it, but somewhere along the way I just kind of stopped vlogging my reactions. So there'll be a link in the description to kind of a video where I've like edited those clips together, but it only covers a handful of the books on this list. So if you're interested in seeing my on-the-spot visceral reactions to some of these books, so I think it's like the first, I don't know, like 5 books that I read specifically for this video, feel free to click, but like no obligation. It was just a case of, I thought I might as well edit them together into something. But this is just going to be me sitting down and chatting with you and talking about what I thought about my best friend's best and worst list. Before embarking on doing this, I thought we had similar-ish taste, but that there were some like crucial differences. I won't tell you up front if I still agree with that hypothesis after reading all of these books. I should also say as well that the books that I read before embarking on this, so I think there's like 4-5 books that I read before deciding to do this, she does know my opinions of. But apart from that, I haven't watched her best and worst list video, but I will be inserting clips throughout this video where she has either said something that is similar to something I've said about a book or directly contradicts my feelings on a book. So yeah, I haven't watched her video, but she also doesn't know my opinion on a lot of these books. So it is going to be interesting for both of us. So this first section of the video is going to be me briefly touching on the books that I had already read and didn't pick up specifically for this video. I filmed my whole like thoughts on a book. Well, I thought I was filming, I forgot to press record. So I'm sorry if this is like, it comes across kind of chaotic, but the first book that I'm going to talk about is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi.
In this, we follow Indigo, and she is manic pixie dream girl, mysterious, like femme fatale. Like, she is all this wrapped up in one. And she ends up marrying her husband with the promise of, if we get married, you will not dig into my past, you will not ask questions. But this all goes to shit when she ends up getting called back to her childhood home to help her ailing aunt. And this house has a, whimsical mind of its own.
This is a book that focuses very heavily on the toxic and at times obsessive nature of friendship. It's a book that by the end of it I really enjoyed, but getting to that point I wasn't necessarily convinced at times. I somehow managed to feel confused about a couple of the different characters. I also predicted one of the major kind of twist reveals.
The reveal at the end, I could see it coming, but I was also not, like, I didn't predict the ending. I had a little inkling of something that happened, and it did happen, but the big reveal I didn't predict.
And I think that possibly slightly impacted on my enjoyment of the story, because I think there's a way to lay suggestions or kind of get your reader guessing about the secrets a story might tell without feeling like it's being dragged out. And I think from the point that I kind of went, oh, this is going to be the twist, to the point that it was confirmed, quite a lot of the story passed, and I felt like I was waiting for that confirmation. But I did end up, by the end of the story, really enjoying it. And I would compare it to something like Pan's Labyrinth. It had that sort of magic and what I dub kind of dark whimsy.
I just think this is one of those books, if you're looking for like a gothic, dark time that has, a whimsical element, that has nuanced conversations woven in through the story, you would really enjoy this.
I do think that the fantasy elements didn't feel particularly fantastical. Like, at no point did I feel like there actually existed magic in this world, but I more felt like it was almost like a game and a story that these friends were telling one another as a coping mechanism, which completely valid. But when you are picking up a book expecting it to be actually fantasy and it doesn't deliver on that, that is going to change your perspective. So I will say that I get why Shannon put this on her best list, because it was a really solid book and it did the toxic friendship really well. The next book is A Song for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers.
So in this, we're in Panga, and we are in a society where robots were made. And they became aware and laid down their tools and went off into the wild. In this, we follow Dex, and they want to be a traveling tea monk. And Dex has the talent for, making brews that just help people heal. And so you follow Dex as they make their way through the world and sell tea. And then Dex meets one of the robots in the wild.
This is actually a book that I think I bought Shannon this book because I loved it so much. I am not usually a cozy fantasy person, but this is a book that I felt so welcomed and loved in.
This was cozy, heartwarming, sitting in an Udi with a cup of tea and just feeling whole. Like, this is soul food for me.
It is a queer normative society, and we're following a genderless robot and a non-binary tea monk as they journey through this area. I'm hoping we'll get more books in the Monk and Robot series because they are so beautiful, so warm, so full of comfort, and I don't know, there's not much I can say about this book, partially because it's been a year and a half, 2 years since I first read it, but I just absolutely adore this series.
If you're looking for something that's short, heartwarming, endearing, cozy, with a non-binary main character, this will be right up your street.
And I'm so glad that Shannon also got something out of this book and really enjoyed it as well. The next book, ironically, was a book that Shannon and I both picked up as a buddy read together. And we have a video, like we both did videos on this, where we picked 3 books that we were both going to buddy read together and didn't tell each other anything about what we thought about those books. And then, created videos responding to what we thought about them. And this book was such a flop for both of us. Those videos were one of the rare occasions where the two of us didn't see eye to eye on books. So we both had 2 flops and one not so much of a flop in the video, but Mr. Magic was a flop for both of us. I really despised this book. You know what? I can't remember why I hated it so much. I think possibly because it didn't go far enough when it comes to the horror, Also, I think this is a book that Kirsten White, the author, needed to write, and for those that it resonates with, this is going to be a book that is going to speak to their soul. But this is a book about evangelical Christianity, Mormonism, like all that kind of thing, and how oppressive it can be. But that's not the book I signed up for.
It sounded like I was going to get this long lost cast members coming back together on this set that was cursed, and there may be like a paranormal element. I thought I was getting like the cursed exorcist, or thought I was getting something, and I just didn't get any of it.
I signed up for something that was very akin to accidents on set of the movie Poltergeist and people dying in strange circumstances. I signed up to a book where you have this mysterious, ominous figure of Mr. Magic, and he's terrorizing these adults that were once on this TV show. Like, that was the book I signed up for. That was the book I wanted. That was not the book that I got. I also thought that the characterization of these adults felt inauthentic for the age that they were. I think Kirsten White, to an extent, backed herself into a corner because they had to be the age they were in order for them to have been children on a TV show at a time where there was an ability for episodes to just kind of disappear. And I think if that TV show had happened more recently, those episodes wouldn't have been able to just disappear in the ether. So it needed to be pre-internet, and obviously these people had to be old enough to have appeared on the TV show. But the problem was that for whatever reason, she wasn't able to write adults that felt like adults, and it did not hit for me. And Shannon was exactly the same.
I just wish that the plot went a total different way. I wish that the cast of characters were a little bit different than what they were, perceived. I don't know, like it just didn't work. It was just lackluster, and I just didn't vibe.
The next book was one that we were both really disappointed when it came out, and in fact, I remember picking it up because Shannon was hating it at the time, and like I wanted to know what was so bad about it. And that was How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. And let me just start by saying that house was not haunted. That house had a possessed puppet, a ridiculous, laughable, stupid, possessed puppet.
This was kind of ridiculous, and not in a way that I could get on board with. I don't mind a ridiculous book or a ridiculous horror, but I just couldn't get on board with this. Like, it was so silly.
This book is one that if puppets creep you out, then yes, it's going to work for you. But for me, it just came across as absolutely ridiculous. And I don't think I realised at the time. So I listened to it as an audiobook. I don't think I realised it at the time, but it's subsequently been pointed out to me that the puppet character is voiced in such a ridiculous and laughable and stupid way.
Pupkin waved at her. He leered and capered. Caca-wee-wee! Pupkin screeched in his high-pitched voice. Pupkin began to sing, dancing from side to side. Pupkin here, what doody-doo, Pupkin here.
That, it is horrible, this book. And I think what made it worse was the fact that it ended up going on for way longer than it needed to be. I think it was in my worst books of the year video where I talked about this, but there was a point, and I don't know if it was 3 hours from the end or if it was 6 hours because I was listening at double speed, and I can't remember if it was 3 actual hours I had left or 3 hours at the speed I was listening to.
There was a POV shift somewhere around the third act mark that just didn't make any sense.
But there was a point there where it felt like the story had reached its conclusion. It felt like an appropriate stopping point. And then there was just more book, a lot more book. And it was just extra information that didn't really feel like it added anything to the book and just made me feel angry and frustrated that I had to put up with even more of this book's writing. So definite flop for me. And then, no, I've got two more. There's two books that I read at the end of last year. I don't think I've really spoken much to Shannon about my feelings on these two books, but I did technically read them last year. And those are A Diary of Blood by S.T. Gibson and The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. So with regards to A Diary of Blood,
this is a Dracula retelling, kinda from the perspective of his first wife.
Overall, I enjoyed it, but I would say that my two main issues were both pretty much on me. And the first was I was a dumb bitch and I didn't read the blurb before embarking on reading this book. Like, I'd read the blurb when I first got a copy in Fairy Loot, but I hadn't read the blurb since then. So I went into this book going, oh yeah, it's going to be XYZ. And of course it wasn't, because that's not what it ever was aiming to be. So that was me being stupid and impacting my own enjoyment of the book.
This was not what I was expecting, because it falls into a more psychological breakdown of Constanza's relationship with Dracula, instead of being surrounding like their vampirism, which I enjoyed, because even though they're vampires and that was, a big plot in the story, it wasn't the main plot. It was something completely different, a new fresh take, and I really enjoyed this.
And then the second thing was that I had some listening hours left on Spotify. So I was like, oh, great, I'll make a start on A Diary of Blood and I'll listen to it. And for whatever reason, I don't think the audiobook for A Diary of Blood works for me, because the moment that I switched format and started reading it physically, I had an infinitely better experience with this book. And I definitely would like to reread it pretty soon, actually, to see how I feel about it, knowing the kind of book that it is now and knowing the story it's trying to tell, and also like not trying to listen to it as an audiobook, because I do think Gibson has an absolutely beautiful way of writing, and I did them a disservice by going in with incorrect expectations and also not just like reading it physically. One little point I want to make about A Diary of Blood, I don't know why, but given Gibson's poetry background, it wouldn't surprise me if this was a deliberate move. But something about the way that Dracula decides to name our main character, Constanta, we're basically told that's not the name she was born with. She was given the name Constanta. Very much reminded me of what I believe is the opening line of Lolita. So let me read it, but subbing out the name Constanta instead of Lolita. So this is the line, and it's how the name Constanta felt like it was read in my head, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does. I apologise if it doesn't. So, Constanta, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Constanta. The tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. So yeah, I don't know why, but like immediately that was the evocative image in my head, and I could almost imagine Dracula saying that to Constanta. And not that I've read Lolita and I have no intention of ever reading it, because my groomer idolised it and thought it was aspirational. I feel like the level of kind of toxicity and feeling of like ownership and control that we see in Humbert Humbert, is that his name? With regards to Lolita, I could also see when it came to Dracula and Constanta. And then with regards to the final empire,
in this we follow Kessler, who is Mistborn, and he is sick of the way the world is, with the Lord Ruler at the head and the Ska working in the ash fields. He decides it's time for a change. He is sick of the way the world is. So he and a ragtag group of misfits and orphans and everything in between come together to try and put a stop to the way the world is and to free the Ska.
I found it incredibly gripping. Also, I ended up having like a 6-month gap in the middle of it. I got about 200 pages in and then got distracted and was reading other books. But like I wanted to continue it, so I didn't DNF it at the time. And when I picked it up in December, I fully expected to not be able to immediately pick up the story and go, okay, this is going to have to be a soft DNF because I'm not going to be able to finish this before the end of the year. But I picked it up and immediately everything made sense, was able to get straight back into the book, and great, like that made me so happy. And it's a rarity that a book is so well structured that you can leave it 6 months without reading a single page of it and it immediately made sense to you. So I had a great time. I think it's quite a unique magic system.
The world in this is so well done. The magic system is a very strict magic system, which I enjoyed. It was something that I could really think there was a lot of effort and a lot of thought put into the magic system, and I loved that, and I loved being in this world.
Sanderson does a good job of not doing much in the way of info dumping. You get the information gradually so that it sticks in your mind and you feel like confident that you have the knowledge. I thought Vin was a great character, and the whole like band of I don't think they're called Band of Misfits, but like the whole band of misfits just all worked really well together. What I will say is that towards the end of the book, there is a battle. I mean, there's quite a few battle scenes, but there's a specific battle scene where I don't like battle scenes. I think they're really hard to execute in a way that's engaging. But this particular battle scene, I feel like it's pretty clear that when Sanderson writes, he sees a movie playing in his head. Whereas like when I read a book, all I see is words. I don't see any images. So battle scenes are a particular challenge for me. So this battle scene, a lot's going on and something significant happens. But the problem is, because I was exhausted and bored by this battle scene and didn't really know what was going on, this thing that was meant to be incredibly emotional had zero impact on me. And that's really annoying because it's such a big moment and it just fell completely flat for me. And I am so disappointed that that was the case, because this book otherwise was such a good time for me. And the thing is, I'm going to be continuing the Mistborn series. Since buying the first 3 books in Mistborn, I've decided that I'm only going to be getting copies secondhand because I don't want my money, no matter how tiny it is or whatever, I don't want my money going towards tithes to the Mormon church. So the best way that I feel like I can read these books ethically is to buy them secondhand. But I do have the first 3 books in Mistborn and I do plan on continuing. In fact, I actually also have The Secret History because I managed to pick it up at my local library when they were selling withdrawn stock. So I have some more Sanderson to pick up. I got to the point last year very quickly where like I wasn't rating books, but I would say it's probably about a 4-star read for me. Like, it was a good time. I just wish that that emotional scene had actually hit for me. Before we get into the books that I picked up this year and read specifically for the purpose of being able to talk about them in this video. First, let's talk about the DNF. So I tried my hardest to not DNF any of the books on this list. And honestly, the fact that I chose to DNF this book, considering some of the other titles on this list, I think is kind of amusing. So this book I did pick up this year, but within about 50 pages, I realised that it just wasn't for me. I was never going to opt not to DNF a book if it genuinely wasn't working for me and I didn't want to continue, kind of thing. So the book that I ended up DNFing was Blood Orange by Harriet Tice. You know, there's not really any spicy opinions here.
I didn't like the writing style. I didn't like any of the characters. I didn't like the plot twists. I was just kind of annoyed, like, through this book.
Essentially, I did not like that the protagonist was a messy alcoholic, and I didn't appreciate that everyone around her was treating her like trash. And it was just something that I didn't want to read another, 300 pages or whatever it was of this book. I did go on Goodreads and look for spoiler reviews. It's something I do if I'm contemplating DNFing a book, but I'm kind of on the fence. I will specifically seek out spoiler reviews and kind of see if there's something in those spoilers that makes me go, oh, okay, I'd actually be interested in continuing this story. But when I sought out those spoiler reviews, all they did was basically verify that this book wasn't something that I was going to enjoy. I saw nothing in those reviews that made me go, oh yes, I'm going to have to continue. I need to see how that plays out. And even though I wasn't far enough in the book to have any kind of theories or any kind of feel for who was like a bad character, I felt like the information I got about who were kind of the villains of the story pretty much tied with what I'd already seen.
I remember specifically starting to predict things that came to fruition. So, and it was very early on in the book as well. So the rest of the book was just a trudge, and I didn't like it.
I don't feel like I missed out on anything, and I can definitely see why this book would not be a hit, because it was tedious as anything, and I salute Shannon for being able to finish it, because I certainly couldn't. And now we get into the books that I picked up this year and managed to complete. So we're going to go through them in chronological order of when I read them. So we're going to start with the one that I read furthest ago and move all the way up to the one that I read most recently. Oh my gosh, I know we're like 25 plus minutes into the video, but like we are coming in spicy, because the first book that I picked up this year to read for this list was Broken Doors by Mick Watson. I think that's how it's pronounced. Mique. Oh my gosh, this was Shannon's worst book of 2023.
I hated it. I hated it. I absolutely hated it.
And I mean, 100%. It was the only book on her list, to my knowledge, that she DNF'd.
This is the book that I DNF'd at 80%. I felt sick. For being such a short book, I just couldn't. I couldn't even make myself finish the last 20%.
She's a much smarter woman than me. Well, I'm non-binary, but you know what I mean. Because why did I put myself through that? I do not understand the purpose of this book. I mean, I get it's extreme horror, whatever. I haven't really ventured very much into extreme horror. Like, at this point, I've read Broken Dolls and I started them and very quickly DNF'd it, because somehow I thought, oh, Broken Dolls has set the bar in hell.
This fell on the absolute burn in hell list. I hated this.
nothing can be worse than Broken Dolls. And then very quickly in them, there is a scene that manages to be worse.
I don't want to come across like I am, being really harsh to the author.
So the only way I can describe Broken Dolls is that it feels like smutty horror for nonces. And this book is so fixated on doing obscene acts to children, and not just that, but like very specific. It's almost like it's got a kink about doing specific things to children. Oh my gosh, I despised it. I despised it so much. My brain is permanently scarred, but more scarred by them. How to describe them? Fetus. That's all I'm going to say. Join the dots and you're probably not even imagining anything half as bad. So yeah, Broken Dolls was so bad, so gratuitous, in a way that I just cannot understand why this was published, how this was published, how anyone could write this kind of book. Like, it makes me wonder about the character of Mick Watson, because, like, how does someone even imagine doing these things? Oh, it's horrendous and horrible and felt like CP and oh.
I felt dirty. I felt like just oof, oof.
And even if you take away all of the vastly inappropriate content of this book, there's some very major issues with this book. The first being that the writing is full of purple prose and reads exactly like a self-published vanity novel reads. The second thing is that the horror was not very well constructed. So you can't divorce it from what the horror actually is, but the issue is that the acts don't really scale. Like, the first thing that they end up having to do, experience, whatever. I've realised I'm not giving blurbs for any of these books, so I apologise. What I'm probably going to have done at this point is just, I'm going to have clips of Shannon describing all of these books. I apologise if this video is particularly chaotic. First act that these people end up doing, you're like, okay, yeah, that's kind of horrific, but like, whatever. Well, not whatever, but it's very, very tame compared to where the book goes. But essentially, it goes from that to 1,000, and that's on a scale of 1 to 10. And the problem is that whilst you might have a feeling about where the story is going to go, scaling the severity of what's happening from 3, 4 to 1,000 means that as a reader, everything's feeling gratuitous at this point, because your preferred outcome for these characters shifts, and you no longer want these characters to survive what's happening to them, and that just makes it all the more painful to read. And I think, not that I support what was written in this book in the slightest, not for a moment, but I think if the things that they did, there was a level of scaling, you could begin to see craft. I don't know, I don't want to talk about this book anymore. So thankfully, the next book that I read was actually a darn good book, and that was Bright Young Women by, oh gosh, I don't remember.
Jessica Knoll.
You'll recognise this book because it made the Goodreads Choice Awards last year, and I know a lot of people were saying just how good it was, and I'm 100% part of that camp because it was really, really good. This is, and I could be wrong because I'm not, I'll watch Netflix documentaries if they come on, but like, I don't watch every single true crime thing. I don't listen to true crime podcasts, so I'm not that knowledgeable when it comes to true crime stories. But I believe this is loosely, I don't know how loosely, but this is based on Ted Bundy. But at no point in this book does it name the defendant. And I respect that. I think that is a really smart choice because it really reinforces that this story is not about the crime or the criminal. This story is about these women that were affected, and it's also about the injustice that they faced as a result of systemic ineptitude and the way that they had to fight to get what they would deserve. That's not a proper sentence. I feel like you know what I mean.
I enjoyed all the characters. I enjoyed the way the story was told. I enjoyed the importance of not giving a name to a killer and showing the after effects and the people that matter in a situation like this.
It was such a beautiful story, and it was also heartbreaking at the same time. Like, you knew it was coming, but it still had a massive emotional impact, and it was just so poignant. And the ending, you know, I can't remember exactly what the ending was, but I was reviewing my vlog clips before I sat down to film this, and I was in tears
I cried at the end of this book.
as I recorded the vlog clip that I, you know, my final feelings, but I do remember it being so emotional, so beautiful, and just overall such a fantastic book. And actually, this is probably the only book on this list that I feel like I've got a good recommendation, kind of comp title for, and that is Penance by Eliza Clark. It's following a different kind of thing. It's taking a very different kind of perspective, but I think it also does a really good job of critiquing the way that the true crime industry works and the way that our perspective is molded by the people that have the power to tell the story, and it's not necessarily the people's story that should be heard. So do recommend picking up that, especially if you enjoyed Bright Young Women. The next book that I picked up was another book of Shannon's best list, and that was Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter.
This one specifically follows this woman, Claire, and she has like the best life. She is living her best life. Married, beautiful house, you know, and everything's going well until she and her husband are mugged and her husband died. And she then has to deal with the fact that she lost her husband, but also the house that they live in was created and built by her husband. So literally, like, she is walking around blind because her husband done everything for her. But there was a reason for that because he had a lot of fucking secrets, I tell you. And some of them, all of them, are just not secrets that you ever want to find out about anyone that you know. She then reconnects with her sister, and together they figure out what happened to her husband and what secrets he was hiding, and also they kind of bond over their missing sister. Their eldest sister has been missing since they were teenagers, and it kind of drove a wedge between their family. And they reconnect and, you know, find out for themselves what happened to their sister. And then also, Claire comes to terms with her pig of a husband.
This was a chunkier book than I think I expected, and probably a chunkier book than I normally read.
It's over 500 pages, and I was worried that it was going to be too big.
It didn't feel chunky. Like, this story was so propulsive. I just had to keep reading and finding out what was going on. I also thought there was a really smart use of a midpoint twist, and it worked really effectively for the story. And it felt like we still managed to get lots of intrigue for the rest of the story, because I think sometimes when an author chooses to have a midpoint twist, it then lessens the impact of later twists, or it reduces their ability to have effective endpoint twists. But this one felt like you were kind of getting twist after twist, but there was a very significant one at the midpoint that, honestly, like, I don't know if there were any hints in the narrative, but I suspect possibly not. But that worked really well for the story and made it all the more satisfying when it occurred. This was a really hard-hitting story, though, because this story was involving distribution of snuff films, and it didn't shy away from the horrors of such things. And there was always going to be a bittersweetness to it, because ultimately, no matter what the conclusion of this story was, nothing was going to bring back the people that had died in the making of these snuff films. But there were some really good punchy moments throughout the book that really reinforced the themes that this book was trying to go for. And as my first time reading a Karen Slaughter, I was just overall really impressed at the grit in this book and just how well crafted it was.
I was here for it, and it made me so excited to pick up more by Karen Slaughter.
And I definitely think I would be interested in picking up more from Slaughter again, especially if it's a book from a more civilian perspective, because I don't like books from a law enforcement perspective, which there was law enforcement, but it was very much like rogue vigilante justice, which full marks for that. The next couple of books are back to things that weren't really a hit. So the first one is Saving Noah by Lucinda Barry.
In this, we follow Noah, who is like a young, well, he's a teenager, and he abuses girls in his swim league. And it follows him and his mum.
So this was an oddity. I said that I didn't know Shannon's thoughts about any of these, except for this one, because we had a discussion as Shannon was reading this book around triggers, and I basically was saying that I don't find mentions of paedophilia in books to be triggering. Like, you know, I'm not saying I like that, don't get me confused, but I don't find that subject matter to be triggering. What I do find triggering in both fiction and real life is the idea that there is any kind of grey area when it comes to such things. Like, I don't know, like the common one that I hear is the idea of, oh, they were 15, they were 25, it was fine, or something like that. And I'm like, no, that's not, it's still not okay. And it's the people that try to defend it by saying, oh, well, it was our experience and it worked fine for us. And it's like, no, please, no. So as a result of that, and because this book does do the grey area thing, I didn't expect to be picking up this book. The fact that it ended up on Shannon's worst list is pretty much the only reason that I ended up picking it up. But because there was no expectation that I was going to be reading it, basically Shannon went full spoilers with me. Obviously, consensual full spoilers. Always get consent if you're going to be spoiling a book. But she went consensual full spoilers with me. So I pretty much knew the beats of this story already going in. And I went in fully expecting to hate it. And initially I didn't. Initially I thought it was a more nuanced take than I was expecting. I also thought that, I can't remember Noah's mother's name. I want to say like Ariadne, but I could be wrong. Adrian, I think it's Adrian. Adrian wasn't as kind of forgiving and my son can do no wrong as I had expected. I'd got the impression that she was kind of vapid and like, la la la, no, he's an angel. But that wasn't what this book gave me, at least initially. She does become more delusional as the book progresses.
You just wanted to shake the main character and be like, get a grip.
But initially she's like, he is disgusting, he did this disgusting thing. But the problem that I really had with this book is that it really tried to paint that grey area.
I just despised the narrative of this book.
Oh, the thing that really irritated me. So we got some point of views from Noah, and Noah is, I think he was 15 when he committed the crime. I think the girls were 6, 8, something like that. And then he's like somewhere between 15 and 17 when you're hearing his point of view. But it's a repeated motif of him basically going, I didn't want to, but I couldn't help myself. You are old enough that if you don't want to do something, you don't. It's as simple as that. Oh, this book was so incredibly tone deaf, frustrating, annoying.
This just wasn't it. Like, I just got angry. So angry.
And actually, I don't think it was good for my own healing. Oh, I despised it with a fiery passion. See, the thing is, when I was thinking about like how I was going to review this book, because in order to get my thoughts straight on every book I read, I type out a written review, you know, standard bookish behaviour. But when I was doing that, I remember thinking, whilst it may not have been a book I would have enjoyed, there was potentially a way that this book could have been written that didn't feel like it was an apologist story, because that's very much what it came across like. And I think in order to do that, what this book needed to do was take place pretty much after the final couple of chapters of this book. Maybe that would form the start of the book, and then you're looking at the aftermath, because there was the hint of a story that could have been more interesting to tell, where you're not looking at how Noah being a disgusting human being impacted him. Instead, you are looking at the lasting impact on the family and the way that that stigma has impacted them. But overall, I just think it was a waste of my time and not a great book. The next book wasn't like offensively bad. I just didn't have a good time with it. And that book was He Started It by Samantha Downing.
It was slow. It was told in a very specific but not fun or entertaining way. We had 2 timelines and a lot of POVs, so you expect there to be a lot of forward momentum, but there just wasn't.
Nothing happens for like a good 200 plus pages in the middle of this book. I thought it started off with a lot of promise. I found myself continuously reaching for it and wanting to read it, and then there was just a slog of nothing happening.
The 3rd act scene just felt cheap, and I just didn't have a good time.
So much is crammed into it, so much happens, and it just gives you whiplash. And overall, my lasting impression of this book was this was the book equivalent of a meeting that should have been an email. Like, this did not need to be a full-length book. This did not deliver on anything. It just did not hit for me. And that was so unfortunate, especially this was my first time reading a Samantha Downing book. And yes, I knew it was on my best friend's worst list.
This one just didn't do it for me. I just think that these characters were unlikable in a way that was grating. It was annoying, and I just didn't care.
So it probably wasn't going to be that good, but I still was hoping for more. I'm a contrary bitch, and I really wanted to have a book where I was like, oh, you hated it? Well, I loved it. Like, not for any kind of nasty reason, but just to be like, huh, interesting. And That was the next book, actually. So the next book was A Twisted Love Story by Samantha Downing. This book, I went in with such low expectations.
A Twisted Love Story, I had high hopes for. It wasn't it.
Because I didn't really know anything about this book, apart from this book was hated in the bookish community. And then also, I knew that it made the worst list from my friend. But I ended up having a really good time with it. I found it really compelling and I just wanted to keep reading, keep seeing more of the story. I think I did guess at one of the twists at the end, but it wasn't something that felt unsatisfying to have guessed. But I think why I ended up liking this book was, well, partially because I went in with really low expectations, but then I think partially because I wasn't looking for it to be a pacey thriller or XYZ. I don't know if maybe part of the issue is that this is being miscategorized. I don't know what I would necessarily categorize it as, but I suppose ultimately you've got to enjoy Wes and Ivy's relationship.
It was so toxic relationship. I was thinking that Samantha Downing was going to bring me another My Lovely Wife scenario where it's like hugely toxic because of not only outside forces and their actions and then them as a couple, but because all encompassing of toxic. But this was just boring. It was just so very boring.
You don't necessarily have to think they are good for each other or should be together, but you have to enjoy the dynamic that these central two characters have. And for me, I really enjoyed their dynamic. And I'm sure Gossip Girl fans around the world are going to disagree with me on this, but I felt like I was getting Chuck and Blair vibes from them. Like, they shouldn't work, they probably shouldn't be together, but you are compelled by them, you are rooting for them, even when they are doing horrible things to each other. You think, yes, I like these two together. And that's how I felt about Wes and Ivy. And then I guess the rest of the story just felt like extra treats. It was interesting to see all the different machinations, is that the right word, that side characters were doing, and the way that this whole house of cards was being built, and then the way it came crumbling down. And then I also really enjoyed the epilogue. I thought it was quite a snarky and biting way to end this story. Also, I am incredibly curious about the dedication to this book. I will pop just a little bit of B-roll on screen so you can see it here, but I don't know if that's meant to be a good thing or a bad thing, but I low-key love it. That's pretty savage. Maybe it's either savage or really sweet. I don't know. But I also really love that I don't know. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm probably like rambly and speaking nonsense at this point, but we are getting close to the end. We have 3 more books to talk about. So the next one is Satan's Affair, and this is book 0.5 in the Cat and Mouse duet.
I didn't like this.
I do intend to read Haunting and Hunting Adeline at some point. I just haven't managed to find the time yet. So I picked it up because it was on my friend's worst list, but I also picked it up because I thought it would be a good starting point for the Cat and Mouse duet. I don't think it necessarily is. I think you're probably actually better off starting with, is it Haunting or Hunting that comes first? I think it's Haunting Adeline, and then going back to this book when you've seen the character of Zane Meadows and you know him a bit better. But this was nonetheless a pleasant surprise. I do think the ending felt quite abrupt and not as satisfying as I would like, but the story as a whole, I wasn't expecting this book to be Polly, so it was like really enjoyable for me to see. And yes, it's dark and the kink is weird.
The fact that The main character was a grown woman acting like a child. It gave me this really weird feeling that I did not like because of the situations that she's in.
But it was still a really enjoyable read, and I loved the sort of vigilante women's wrongs of it all about this book. And overall, I had a really fun time. Like, yes, it's dark, it's ridiculous, but I think that there's a fairly good chance that I am going to enjoy the cat and mouse duet. But I suppose we'll see.
If you have any dark romance recommendations, please leave them down below, because I will give anything a try.
So I guess that's another book I disagreed with Shannon on. Like, who am I? And then the final two books that I had to read were both books from her best list. So first up, we had The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sandhu Mandana.
This follows Mika Moon, who is a witch, and there are other witches in this world, but they have it a secret, because obviously they can't be found out, so they only meet like once a month, and Mika does TikTok videos being a witch, and her coven leader doesn't really like that because they think that it can expose them. But Mika's like,
no one's gonna think I'm an actual witch.
Until one day, someone messages her and is like, I know you're a witch and we need your help immediately. So she goes and helps this family, this group of collective people that become a family. She helps children who are witches come into their power and becomes part of this very endearing, very loving collective family.
This book I was nervous to pick up because of all the books on her best list, this was the one that I thought, I don't know if I'm going to like it. And I know that it made Shannon nervous for me to pick up because I don't have the best of luck with cozy fantasy.
I loved this. Similar to the Psalms of the Wild Bull, this fed my soul. This gave me breath. This gave me life.
The last time I tried to read a cozy fantasy, I did not like it. It was just too fluffy and the stakes just weren't there. But I think there's several things that made this book work for me. Part of it was the fact that whilst it is, I guess, technically cozy, there were very real stakes to the story. And there was some emotional grit as well. Another thing that I think made this different from the last time I tried to make cozy fantasy is read cozy fantasy, was that this book didn't feel like it was trying to live in a vacuum where it's a fantasy world. All the woes of the world are magically better. Our main character, Mika Moon, still had a painful childhood, still was coming into contact with racism. Like, there were injustices in the world. And I think that grounding in reality, even though this was a fantastical story where people could flow and cars could be enchanted to travel large distances in very short amounts of time, worked for it and gave that level of gravitas that I think I need in order to read a book. I also listened to it as an audiobook, and I think that worked really well. I don't think it would have detracted from my enjoyment to have read it physically, but I think the audiobook production was particularly well done, and I would recommend if you're someone that gets along with audiobooks and are able to listen to it. I am mildly nervous about, I know it's not a sequel, it's like a companion novel set in the same world, but I'm mildly nervous about the next book that this author is bringing out later this year, because I don't know if this is a book that worked on its own because it was a surprise and just everything just came together just right, or if this author can repeat the same level of magic, if you excuse the pun. And the final book that I get to talk about is Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas.
This follows Rajiel, who wants to prove himself a real brujo, and he does this ceremony and he does it behind the backs of his strict family, and he then manages to summon a ghost of Julian, who is the resident bad boy at their school, and together they kind of find what's happening to kill these people and what's going on in the world of their magic.
This was me saving the best for last, and I think it actually might have been the best book that I read for this video. I could be wrong. I will do a ranking after I finish gassing about this book, but oh, it was so good. It was a book that only a member of the Latinx community could write and do justice to.
This has an atmosphere in it that just, I haven't read an atmosphere so rich and detailed like this in a while, and I just absolutely adored it.
There was a particular scene that stood out to me about someone wielding a chancellor, and it reminded me of, don't for a moment think I'm conflating a Japanese man with a member of the Latinx community, but like, it reminded me of when I used to do judo. My sensei would get a slipper. I wish I could remember what they were called, but he would get a slipper. It would be like gentle and affectionately, but he would like tap people if they were doing their moves wrong, and it reminded me of that. And this scene involving the chancellor, it was very clear this wasn't abusive or stereotype. This was a scene that was written with affection and understanding, and it kind of, for me, became emblematic of this book as a whole, with the way that Thomas wrote about a variety of different cultures that were preparing for Day of the Dead, and the way that they approached thinking about grief and remembrance. And there's something so wholesome and healing about looking at something that for me is a sad thing, but there was a joy to this book. It was a classic, like, don't weep for me, I'm not gone, I'm only sleeping. I suppose in this case, the Brewhacks were kind of literally only sleeping because they got to see their beloved ancestors for Day of the Dead. They got to sit in community with them every year, and that was something really lovely and enlightening. I also really enjoyed the romance between Julian and Yadriel.
Radriel and Julian were so well done. Like, they were such a dynamic duo that I just fell in love with them immediately.
They were so cute together, and I believe there's going to be a sequel at some point, so I can't wait for that. But yeah, I'm really sorry. I'm so bad at talking eloquently or not talking just absolute garbage about books that I enjoyed, but I had such a good time with this book.
This made me cry.
So now I'm going to pop on screen a graphic that shows the order that Shannon thought would be my rankings when it came to my feelings about the books that I read for this video. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the graphic into two separate ones. So this graphic is going to be the worst list, and you'll see at the top that we have got, oh, my belly's rumbling, that we've got the ranking that Shannon thought I was going to give these books. And then let's have a look and see what I thought. So, did I say best or worst? We're going to go with worst. Okay, so for the worst, we'll start with the worst of the worst and move up to the best of the worst. We've got, at the very bottom, Broken Dolls. I think that's not a surprise at all. And then it goes Saving Noah, which again, I feel like that's not really a surprise. How to Sell a Haunted House. I would gladly never have to think about that book ever again. Blood Orange. It's hard to judge because that was a DNF, but I'm going to say Blood Orange goes next because at the end of the day, I couldn't get more than 50 pages through it. Then Mr. Magic, he started it, and then the final two books I actually wouldn't put on a worst list, but it goes Satan's Affair and then the best of the worst was A Twisted Love Story. And now let's have a look at the best. So as you can see, it's the same kind of layout. So we have a graphic that shows the ranking that Shannon thought I was going to rank them in, and this is my ranking. Okay, so going from the worst to the best to the best of the best, we've got The Last Tale of the Flower Bride, The Final Empire, A Dowry of Blood, Pretty Girls, Bright Young Women, A Song for the Wild-Built, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, and Cemetery Boys. So I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I want to thank Shannon for allowing me to use clips from her best and worst of 2023 video, and for joining me on this journey as I read your best and worst. Please do subscribe to her if you aren't already. She's so close to 1,000 subscribers, and in fact she may even be at 1,000 by the time this video goes out, hopefully, because she deserves the world. So before I go, with regards to my hypothesis, I think it still is yet to be seen whether Shannon and I's taste is very, very close. I think there's been some very decided differences between our tastes in this video, but I think as a general overarching thing, I would say that there's a pretty high likelihood that if she doesn't like a book, it's not going to work for me. As much as I enjoyed A Twisted Love Story and Satan's Affair, I don't feel as if I would have missed out on something revolutionary had I chose not to pick it up off her recommendation. And then with regards to books that she loves, I would say that, well, I don't think a single one of the books that made her best list I disliked. I think we're gonna have differences with which we find the best, but there's also an element of scale. Like, my lifestyle is very different to Shannon's, and I only have one person that I live with, whereas Shannon's got a very different life that is full of a lot more socialization. So I will end up reading more books than her, and as a result, you know, her best books are probably going to hit for me, but I may have a better book that I've read just because I've had more opportunity to pick it up. But I think that's enough of me philosophizing. So all that is left for me to say is love you. Thank you. Bye.
I hope that if you pick up any of these books because of this video, you enjoy every single one, not the worst ones. Pick up the worst ones at your own risk.